The first sound I heard was my son's scream. High-pitched, panicked, and raw. It cut through the quiet of our Saturday morning like a blade. I turned from the kitchen just in time to see him running toward the front door, tears already streaking down his cheeks, hands fluttering in the air, trying to sign through his shock. I dropped the mug I was holding. It shattered against the tile, but I barely noticed. I followed his frantic gaze and ran outside barefoot. Two strangers stood on our lawn. One held a clipboard, the other gripped Max's leash. Max, our golden retriever, my son's trained service dog, was being dragged toward the open gate. My son collapsed on the grass, sobbing and pulling at the air with shaking fingers, unable to form the signs. My heart raced as I ran past him and threw myself between the man and my dog. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "That's a service animal. He's certified. You can't just take him." Karen was standing near the mailbox, arms folded like a queen overseeing an execution. She didn't flinch when I turned on her. "We warned you. Non-compliant animals are not allowed per HOA Regulation 12, she said calmly, as if she hadn't just shattered my son's entire sense of security. "That's my son's service dog. He's hearing-impaired. That dog is trained to alert him to sounds. You know this." She looked at me with pity soaked in condescension. "I know you think rules don't apply to you just because you're emotional, but this isn't personal. It's policy." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear something apart. Instead, I stood frozen as they clipped Max into the back of a black SUV and slammed the door. My son was still sobbing, and I was already calculating my next move. Before we moved here, peace was something I only imagined in stolen moments. My legal career kept me racing through courtrooms and sleepless nights, and after my husband left, everything fell squarely on my shoulders. There were no grandparents to call, no siblings to lean on. Just me, and my son, and the soft rhythm of our little family trying to hold together in a world that never slowed down for either of us. He was born with moderate to severe hearing loss. We caught it early, and I did everything I could to give him a world that wouldn't feel silent. We learned sign language together. I found the best specialists, pushed for the best schools, fought for accommodations at every step. But even with all that, there was a loneliness in him I couldn't fix. The kind that lives in the spaces between other kids' laughter and the constant question marks in adults' eyes. Then came Max. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline. Trained from puppyhood, he learned to recognize the oven timer, the school bell, the sound of my son's name. He could wake him in the morning, alert him to fire alarms, guide him through crowds. But more than any of that, Max saw him. He didn't speak differently to him, didn't pity him, didn't hesitate to curl up beside him when the noise of the world got too much. He was steady, warm, always there. When we finally saved enough to leave the cramped apartment and buy this home, I thought we were entering a new chapter. The neighborhood looked quiet. Tree-lined streets, fresh paint, families who waved from porches. I read the HOA bylaws carefully, searching for any sign of trouble. It seemed safe, reasonable. I thought we could belong here. I remember the way my son smiled when we brought Max into the backyard for the first time. He ran through the grass, arms wide, Max bounding beside him. That was the moment I let myself believe we were going to be okay. I didn't know peace here was conditional, or that it would come at a price. The first time I met Karen, she was holding a clipboard and frowning at my trash bins. It was our third day in the neighborhood. I was still unpacking boxes and trying to figure out which light switches controlled what. She introduced herself as the head of the HOA Compliance Committee and said it with the same pride one might reserve for a medical degree. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, her lipstick perfectly applied, and her tone practiced, clipped, and just sharp enough to sting. She pointed out that my bins were 2 inches too far from the curb. I apologized, told her we'd just moved in, and promised to correct it. She didn't smile, just nodded, scribbled something, and moved on. I remember watching her walk away and thinking she looked like someone auditioning for the role of suburban tyrant in a community theater production. Over the next few weeks, she appeared often, once to comment on the color of our porch light, another time to hand me a flyer on approved lawn heights. The real tension started when she noticed Max. He was lying quietly on our porch, head resting on his paws, leash curled beside him. She asked if he was a pet or a working animal. I told her he was a certified service dog. Her eyes narrowed just slightly before she nodded and walked away. Then came the formal notices. A warning letter about unregistered animals, followed by another citing potential noise complaints. I asked her directly what the issue was, but she kept circling back to vague phrases about bylaws and maintaining community standards. The implication was clear. Max was a problem, and by extension, so were we. It wasn't confrontation. Not yet. But it was coming. I felt it every time she glanced toward our house, like we were under inspection, like we were already guilty. It started with paper. Thick white envelopes with the HOA logo stamped across the front began appearing in our mailbox every other day. At first, they were nuisances. Notices about minor violations that made no sense. A warning for an unauthorized decorative item that turned out to be a small wind chime on our porch. A citation for unauthorized use of common green space, after Max sat beside my son on the park bench near the playground. Then came the letter that made my hands shake as I read it. The board was demanding the removal of the non-approved animal from the premises. They claimed that Max had not been registered through the proper HOA channels, which, according to their own bylaws, didn't apply to federally recognized service animals. I sent them documentation, a full dossier of Max's certification, training, medical necessity, and the applicable federal protections. I addressed the letter to the board directly, but Karen's name was the only one that ever came up in the responses. They ignored everything. The next week, they started fining us. $50 a day. I called the management office, asked to speak with someone neutral. The woman on the phone sounded nervous, hesitant. She told me quietly that it was best to stay on Karen's good side. I stopped going to HOA meetings after the second one. The room was small, stale, full of forced smiles and whispered gossip. Karen ran them like a courtroom, speaking over anyone who tried to question her. When I brought up the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, she waved a stack of papers at me and said the board had unanimously agreed that Max did not qualify. No one around the table looked me in the eye. My son asked me that night if Max was in trouble. I told him no. I told him Max wasn't going anywhere. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure anymore. They weren't just trying to enforce rules, they were trying to push us out, and I could feel the walls closing in. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I had just come back from court and changed into sweatpants, hoping to finally relax for an evening. My son was in the living room, signing along with a children's show, Max curled beside him on the rug like always. I was heating up leftovers when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite kind of ring either. It was aggressive, insistent. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door with my heart already uneasy. Karen stood on the porch with two men I didn't recognize. One wore a badge that said, Neighborhood Compliance Officer. The other had gloves and a leash in his hand. Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. We're here to enforce an immediate animal compliance order, she said, as if reading off a script. The board has voted unanimously. You were given ample warning. I blocked the door with my body. This is illegal, I told her. Max is a federally protected service animal. You can't just show up and... One of the men pushed past me. My son started screaming before I even saw what they were doing. Max had jumped to his feet, barking for the first time in months, backing toward my son. The man grabbed at his collar. Max growled. My son lunged forward, trying to shield him with his arms. It was chaos, sharp and fast. I was yelling, the room spinning, trying to get between them. They clipped Max's leash and dragged him toward the door. My son collapsed on the floor, rocking, his hands smacking the carpet. I shouted for them to stop, shouted that I was an attorney, that I would sue, that this was a violation of state and federal law. Karen only raised her eyebrows slightly, then turned and walked down the steps. I called the police. They came 20 minutes later, took statements, and then shrugged. It was a civil matter, they said. HOA jurisdiction. Take it up with the courts. I sat on the kitchen floor with my son clinging to my side, his face buried in my sweater, his body shaking with sobs. Max was gone. I held my son and stared at the wall, my mind already turning, already preparing. I didn't know where they took him, but I knew one thing. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, I put on a black suit, not my usual courtroom attire, not the one I wore to make juries like me. but the one I reserved for when I wanted people to be afraid. My son stayed home from school. He barely looked at his breakfast. The silence in the house felt unnatural. Max's absence clung to every corner like dust that wouldn't sweep away. I opened a new case file and titled it Max v. Ho. I began gathering everything: certified documentation, veterinary records, disability assessments, witness statements, dated correspondence. I printed emails, scanned letters, highlighted every threat they had sent. I called the vet, the trainer, the licensing agency. I built a wall of evidence so tall and airtight it could have suffocated a judge. But I didn't go in guns blazing. That was what they expected. Instead, I sent a polite letter to the HOA board requesting a full accounting of the seizure, citing the relevant sections of the Fair Housing Act and ADA. I asked for proof of the vote they claimed had taken place. I requested minutes, bylaws, decision logs, and when they didn't reply, I sent a follow-up, then a third. I filed a preliminary injunction. Quietly, precisely. I contacted local disability advocacy groups and let them know what happened. A reporter friend owed me a favor, so I mentioned it to her over coffee. I called the sheriff's department and requested their body cam footage from the incident, just to make sure nothing had been doctored. When Karen passed me in her car 2 days later, she didn't wave. She slowed down, though, long enough to look. She must have seen the difference. I wasn't the mother pleading anymore. I was the attorney who had taken down pharmaceutical giants, sued biotech firms into bankruptcy, won settlements that made headlines. She thought she had silenced me, but she had only activated the part of me that never lost. And this time, it was personal. Karen didn't stay quiet for long. Within a week of my letters going unanswered, the neighborhood newsletter arrived. Folded neatly, printed in soft pastel colors, it looked harmless at first glance. Until I reached the section titled Community Concerns. There, in carefully worded paragraphs, was a vague but unmistakable attack. The HOA had been forced to temporarily remove a potentially dangerous animal from the premises to ensure community safety and compliance. The newsletter made no mention of Max's certification, or my son, or the trauma they had caused. Just words like liability, disruption, and unauthorized. Neighbors who once smiled now looked away. One woman I had spoken to at the park crossed the street when she saw me coming. Another pulled her dog closer as we passed. My son's classmates stopped coming over for playdates. The message was spreading. Karen wanted everyone to believe that Max had been a threat and that I had been careless. I found a note taped to my door the next day. It wasn't signed. It read, "Maybe you should live somewhere better suited for your kind of situation." I stared at the handwriting for a long time, wondering how many of them agreed with her. How many had silently voted to let this happen. Then one evening, a knock came. A young man stood there, shifting nervously. He introduced himself as Greg, said he worked maintenance part-time for several houses on the block. He glanced over his shoulder before whispering that he had seen Max. Said Karen was keeping him inside her guest house, that the dog wasn't being walked, wasn't being fed properly, just lying there day after day. I thanked him, closed the door, then locked it behind me. That night I opened a second file, this one labeled Animal Cruelty. The morning of the raid was still and overcast. I arrived at Karen's house just after 9, trailed by 2 sheriff's deputies, an animal control officer, and a certified veterinary technician. The emergency injunction had come through faster than I expected. The evidence was overwhelming. I had statements, photographs of Max, audio clips of my son crying for him in the middle of the night. I had the law on my side now, not just moral outrage, and I had patience. I waited until the legal path was clear before striking. Karen opened the door in a robe, her hair still pinned. She tried to act surprised, tried to speak over me, but I handed her the paperwork without a word. One of the deputies read her the order. She stared at it, her face slowly folding in on itself as the reality sank in. Her voice rose in protest. She claimed harassment, invasion, trespassing. None of it mattered. The officer told her to step aside. We moved past her, into the side hallway, then through the back door that led to the guest house. The lock gave after a few seconds. Inside, it smelled like mildew and dust. The lights were off. The windows had been covered. Max lay on a threadbare blanket in the far corner, his ears twitching as we entered. His fur was matted, his eyes were dull. He didn't bark or move. He simply looked up, as if too tired to hope. I dropped to my knees and called his name. He lifted his head. Then, slowly, he rose and crossed the room. Unsteady at first, then faster. He pressed his body against mine and whined softly. I held him, felt his ribs beneath my hands, the shallow rhythm of his breathing. The vet began checking his vitals while the officer took photos. When we got back home, my son stood frozen in the doorway. Then he ran forward, his hands moving too fast to read. Max let out a low bark and bounded toward him. They collapsed into each other in a tangle of fur and limbs and laughter. That was the sound of justice beginning. Not in a courtroom, not with a gavel, but right there, on our front lawn. Court was packed. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table, flanked by two HOA attorneys who looked like they had walked into the wrong case. She had traded her clipboard for a silk blouse and pearl earrings, but her expression hadn't changed. That same cold confidence, the kind that believes power is permanent and reputation is untouchable. She wouldn't look at me. Not once. My son sat in the second row behind me, flanked by an advocate from the Disability Center and our neighbor Greg, who had agreed to testify. Max was back to his usual self by then, healthy again, bright-eyed, sitting quietly in the aisle as my son ran gentle fingers through his fur. I opened with federal statute, the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I showed the court-certified training logs, psychological evaluations, vet reports, and every violation the HOA had issued without legal grounding. Then I brought up the seizure, the unauthorized entry, the denial of my son's rights. I let the law speak first, and when that foundation was solid, I leaned into the story. I spoke about my son's nights without sleep, the regression in his communication, the fear in his eyes when someone knocked at the door. I described Max's condition when we found him, the smell in the guest house, the absence of food and clean water. The courtroom was silent. Karen's lawyer tried to argue procedural missteps, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, a communication breakdown. I countered with written notices, emails, timestamps, video footage. The judge asked Karen directly whether she had authorized the dog's confinement. She said she had only been following the board's directive. That was when I played the audio. A voicemail Karen left on the HOA president's phone, unaware he had grown uneasy with her tactics. In it, she bragged about teaching that woman a lesson and showing everyone what happens when you challenge the rules. It was short, but it was enough. The ruling came swiftly. The court ordered damages for emotional distress, medical and legal expenses, and a public apology to be issued in the next HOA meeting. The judge reprimanded the HOA board and recommended a formal audit of their practices. Karen stood frozen as the gavel fell. She didn't speak. Her lawyers began packing her things. I turned to my son, who was already signing something to Max. It was over, and it was ours. Karen didn't show up to the next HOA meeting. The room was full, chairs dragged out into the hallway, neighbors standing along the walls, all waiting to see what would happen next. The board president, newly elected after the last one resigned quietly, read the court's ruling aloud. The words hung in the air like smoke. Violations of federal protections, gross misconduct, intentional harm to a child with disabilities. Someone asked if Karen would be appealing. The answer was no. The apology was printed in the next newsletter, tucked between a recipe for zucchini bread and a reminder about the upcoming block party. It was formal, impersonal, but there, she had no choice. The board fined her for legal costs, then billed her for the HOA's share of the settlement. A few weeks later, a moving truck pulled into her driveway. Boxes piled onto the curb. Her pristine flower beds wilted. By the end of the month, the house sat empty. I started seeing faces I hadn't seen in a while. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me now offered small waves. Some even brought over cookies, plates of brownies, one woman with tears in her eyes and no words, just a hug. A few admitted they had felt uneasy about what happened but hadn't known how to speak up. I didn't forgive them right away, but I listened. The HOA restructured. They invited me to join the new board. I declined. I didn't want a clipboard. I wanted peace. My son returned to school. He smiled more. The nightmares stopped. Max settled back into his place by the door, alert and calm, tail thumping when my son walked into the room. One evening, a new family moved in across the street. They had a daughter in a wheelchair and a golden retriever puppy. My son ran outside to wave at her. She waved back. Max stood beside him, watching quietly. That night, as I watched them from the porch, I realized something important. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's about making space for something better to grow in the silence that follows. Months passed, and the sharp edges of that season began to dull. Our days settled back into something gentle. My son laughed more freely, not with hesitation but with full-bodied joy. He and Max were inseparable again, their rhythm restored, their language effortless. Each morning, Max waited by the front door, ears perked, as if he knew the school bus by the sound of its tires. My son signed to him through the window as it pulled away, and Max watched until it disappeared around the corner. I went back to work, but something had shifted. My cases felt different. I took on a few clients I might have once turned away. People with quiet voices, who had been dismissed too many times, people who had tried to do everything right and still ended up bruised by bureaucracy. I knew their story now. I had lived it. Karen became a cautionary tale, not just for our neighborhood but for others too. The news story about Max traveled farther than I expected. A few podcasts picked it up. Disability rights groups asked if I would speak at conferences. I said yes, once or twice, not to relive the pain, but to lend it purpose. At night, I sit on the porch with Max at my feet and the soft glow of the house behind me. My son sleeps soundly upstairs. There are no patrols outside our door, no watchers with clipboards, only quiet, only peace, and the knowledge that when the time came, I didn't just survive, I answered.